The year was 1975. New York City. There was a gathering of VIPs, what Marilyn Manson would call the beautiful people. They had gathered to experience a showing of a new film by a promising young director and a riveting young actor. And during a bathroom break, Carole King, who was at the event with her boyfriend Rick Evers, runs into Yoko Ono. Happy Easter. We'll be back with the rest of the story. And we're back, and I'm John Kirkwood. This is Church Without Walls, and this is my partner,
Payton.
And it's Easter, and we hope you're having a great Easter in quarantine. We've been hearing from all of you who have been writing into us and been watching or sharing our show, so we're grateful to share our Easter with you today. I don't know if you're in pajamas or having coffee. We felt we'd get dressed up today, just for the hell of it. But we invite you, before I get back to New York and the premiere of Taxi Driver, we invite you to share with us today in communion or the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist. And at the end of the show, we will break bread together. And watching online, I've noticed that people are going back and forth and arguing about whether that's something that is possible, that you can do without a priest or apart from a church. And I want you to know this is not a new argument. This is something that's gone on for quite some time. This is what people do. Religious people, they argue about stuff like this, and then it loses all meaning. And they even argue to the point where they might burn each other at the stake or, bomb school buses and stuff. So I just want to let you know, I want to be still your beating heart. If you believe it's a sin to share in communion apart from a priest in your church, then please don't partake. But I want to just say a few things about that in case you are nervous about it. You don't need a priest to sit at the Lord's table. And if you ask your priest, when did this institution start? He's going to tell you in the upper room on the night of our Lord's arrest, where our Lord was sharing a Passover Seder with the 12. You know the story. I won't reiterate it here. But the Passover was the one feast in the Jewish panoply that was partaken at home. As a matter of fact, the upper room was a dining room and a living room in a normal house, and there was no priest there. And so I think it's just fine that we do this even through the internet in each other's dining rooms. So at the end of the show, we'll break bread if you'd like. If not, that's okay. And we're going to do a whole show on this in the future about how people argue about how to do it right, and really there's just a really basic, simple way that minimal facts argument, if you will. 1975, Robert De Niro was about to utter that famous phrase that he'd become favorite for. "You talking to me?" as Travis Bickle. And Carole King had to go to the bathroom. And she went to the bathroom and bumped into Yoko Ono, whom she had never met before, although she had met John previously in New York years prior. And he had humiliated Carole King in front of a party of people. And yet, Yoko invited Carole and her boyfriend up to their apartment after the movie, and she graciously said, of course. And they left the movie early because back in those days, John was such a celebrity that if he left a movie after it ended, he'd be swamped with people from New Yorkers and so forth. So they snuck out early and they go to the apartment. And at first it's a little bit uncomfortable because Carole is not sure if John remembers how he had insulted her in years past. So they began to talk, and Carole King brought it up. She said, John, I don't know if you remember, but I met you before here in New York City. I met you a while back, and you were so rude to me. And out of the four Beatles, she recalls in her book, in her autobiography, she recalls that they were all pleasant. They were all very kind to her. And John was the fourth Beatle she met. And when she met him, he was surrounded by girls who were not his wife. And he was very intoxicated and high. And he humiliated her in front of the room. And she left the party. And to her surprise, John remembered. And he apologized. And she said, well, why did you do that? And he said, well, to be honest with you, that was when I was younger and I was intimidated. I considered you and your husband, I considered King and Goffin the best songwriters in the world. And so I was intimidated and I reacted poorly. Do you forgive me? And she was moved by his humility and graciousness. And then John turned to her boyfriend, Rick Evers, and he said, what does your man have to say? And to her embarrassment, Rick went on for a lengthy time. John was very patient. Yoko were listening. They didn't interrupt him. But he went on for a lengthy time talking about how there's going to be turmoil in the United States. And he wanted to prepare kind of like a compound to survive the Armageddon. And he talked about how they were looking for a place to move in Idaho or in the mountains, and they were going to stockpile goods, fuel and water, and they're going to grow their own vegetables and all this. And he made a passionate argument for preparation and survival when things hit the fan. And Carole said some of this she hadn't heard before, and she was a little bit embarrassed by it. When he stopped speaking, John kind of clasped his hands together and said, well, I just couldn't do that. I mean, I'd have my bag of rice, but what about everyone else? I bring this story up to you because we are in the midst of a crisis, and Christians are talking about the end times and Armageddon and how they should prepare. And I thought to myself when I read that story a few years ago, this smacks of that kind of attitude, that the people who are standing around awaiting the rapture, and they're really no good to God in time, and they're no good to their neighbors in time, because they have this apocalyptic cloud around them. My father used to say the people who are interested in prophecy and they're obsessed by Bible prophecy and blood moons and all this, he said they care more about the coming of the Antichrist than the coming of Christ. And I know this is a small corner of the Christian room, but I sense that when we are in times of crisis, Christians start acting funny. And instead of running to the sound of the roar, we retreat into little cloistered communities. And this is our time. This is when we are to bind up the brokenhearted. This is when we are to remove our cloak, to get on our knees, to bring the basin of water and the towel to wash one another's feet. This is where we're to commit to something that's larger than temporal things. I bring this up at Easter because Easter is a marriage, and maybe the only marriage that's built on a funeral. The Apostle Paul writes in Ephesians 5 that husbands are to love their wives as Christ loved the church, gave himself for the church. Now, people are talking about the Easter story. Every year, there's a dance that happens between atheists and Christian apologists. And the dance goes something like this. The atheists will print something, or in our day, it used to just be in Newsweek and Time and other magazines saying, did Jesus really exist? And then the apologist would answer with information, and they'd argue over the evidence, and that became the story. And every year we fall for the same bait, and we offer evidence to a world that isn't asking for it. As a matter of fact, when you ask people about their doubts or objections to Christianity, it's usually never information-based. It's usually not based on the facts or the minimal facts or the evidence or the empty tomb. It's usually based on things that are more concrete, like behavioral patterns. Hypocrisy in the church. They don't see anything special about Christians. As a matter of fact, they see derogatory things about the way Christians behave. They might have questions and doubts, but it's really not the main obstacle for their belief. And so people are expressing emotional doubt to us that isn't based on information, and we're offering them information in one year, out the other. So this dance goes around and around, and we train our apologists in soaking in information so they can give it out to a deaf world. And what people are really looking for is, are Christians living on resurrection ground? And I'd like to share that with you today in the story of Cleopas. Cleopas is a little-known character in the Easter story, and I'm assuming, for the sake of argument, that you all kind of know the Easter story, and at least the basics of it. Now, my brother texted me yesterday that he saw something on TV that a bunch of young people were being asked about the resurrection. They kind of really didn't know what it was. They didn't know what the meaning of Easter is. And so I guess I'm hoping that y'all kind of know that the resurrection, or Easter, is celebrating that Jesus Christ rose again the third day after he was put to death on order of Pontius Pilate. And I'm not going to reiterate that story because you can find that all over YouTube right now. I want to look at the slivers of the story that sometimes we ignore. I want to look at the peripheral and come into the sideways. And the story of Cleopas is fascinating. Cleopas was a disciple. Now, he wasn't present on the night. He wasn't present on the night of the Last Supper when the Lord was arrested. I don't know where he was, but he wasn't in the upper room, so he must have heard about it secondhand. And when we find him, he's walking out of Jerusalem on the Emmaus Road, so taking a 7-mile trip going home. And he's distraught. He's just come from a funeral. And not just a normal funeral, but the funeral of somebody he had hoped would be the deliverer of Israel. It was his political candidate to rid Israel of political oppression, of physical scarcity, of being on the lowest point of the totem pole as far as the glory of nations go. There was an anticipation of a messianic-like figure that would come based on promises in the prophets and the writings and the Torah, that would come and deliver Israel from servitude and from disgrace. And Israel was living in disgrace at this time, and so people were anxious and they were upset. And in Jesus, they waved palm branches to their king. They thought Jesus was the guy. After all, he was ticking off all the boxes of what the Messiah would look like. He was straightening the withered hand. He was producing bread for thousands to eat from loaves and fishes. He's walking on water. He's healing the blind. He's even, according to testimonies, raising the dead. And of course, this must be the Messiah. This is somebody who's clearly sent of God because of all these miracles. And this is aside from the way he talked. Nobody talked like Jesus. In all of their lifetime, they had seen the Sanhedrin rule. They had seen the Pharisees parade through the streets in their self-righteousness, and no one got under their skin like Rabbi Jesus, like this Nazarene. And his words would stop the doctors of the law in their tracks. And ever since he was 12 years old in the temple, he had this gift to get people to think outside the box. And sometimes he'd leave them speechless, and sometimes he'd leave them spitting mad. And let's face it, even the atheists of our day, the honest ones, the true skeptics in our day, men like H.G. Wells or agnostics like, I'm going to throw Einstein in as an agnostic because he was kind of a deist, but even men like that, when they look at Christ, even men who were spiritual leaders in other religions like Gandhi, when they look at Christ, they say, history's built around this guy. There's nobody who's ever lived who comes close to the person of Jesus Christ in his word and his character and in his deeds. H.G. Wells, who was kind of a spitting mad atheist, said, there's no one in history like him. And so in his day, he was astounding. He was remarkable. And he was a person who, with his words, could get violent men to put stones down and religious men to lift them up. And so he goes to Jerusalem, and the people are worried about, his people are worried about him. Doesn't he know he's putting himself in danger? He's putting us at risk. And of course, you know the story. He's crucified, and everyone's distraught because even though he had taught the resurrection, even though he taught that the Son of Man would be in the grave for 3 days as Jonah was in the belly of the fish, somehow it didn't click. It didn't resonate. Maybe they thought he was speaking in metaphor when he talked about the leaven of the Pharisees, and he wasn't talking about real bread. And they might have chalked it off to some kind of high-level platonic talk that they couldn't really discern. And yet, the women go to the tomb and find it empty, and the angels announce he's not there. And now we find Cleopas. He's going home with another disciple. He's walking. He's depressed. And he bumps into Jesus. Now, he doesn't recognize Jesus. We don't know why. The text isn't specific. But he doesn't recognize Jesus. He's not expecting to see him. And what happens? Jesus says, what's the matter? What are you guys talking about? And they look at him and they're kind of stymied. I mean, the text kind of implies they're like, who's this dolt? It's the news in Jerusalem. This was a night unlike any other night, because the Messiah was killed, and it's made all the headlines, right? All the chattering around town and in the marketplace was about the Nazarene was put to death. And there was a sadness and a despair among those who thought that this was going to be a new golden age for Israel, that they'd be freed of the Roman yoke, and a new glory days would usher in like in the days of David. And this, our king, would lead us into glory and prosperity and peace. And so they say to him, "What are you the only person in Judea who doesn't know about the death of the Nazarene? Jesus the Nazarene." Now listen to what they say about him. They don't call him the Messiah. They say he was a prophet sent of God. Well, in most conditions, that would be a great compliment, but not in the case when God walks around man. This was a demotion. And I don't know if Jesus face palmed, or rolled his eyes, but he said, "No, tell me what happened." And he said, they put him to death. We thought he'd be the deliverer of Israel. You see, Israel at the time was looking for temporal deliverance, and they were under a burden that they carried. And Jesus, in his life, was trying to show them that burden wasn't real. That burden was as light as a dandelion. And Jesus' life showed them how to live under oppression. Not just the oppression of the Romans. I mean, if you read about Jesus' life, that's like an asterisk. It's like a side note. More importantly was the oppression and the blindness of the one true religion, Judaism, which didn't recognize their own God when he walked among them. And so Israel is awaiting health and prosperity. We live in a country today that's looking for health and prosperity. And 95% of all our conversations are about the coming election, are about the coronavirus, how we dealing with quarantine. And look, I don't want to diminish these things. They're important. I mean, they make the difference of whether we're going to be able to put food on our table, what kind of future we're going to offer for our kids in temporal and physical means, how we relate to our neighbors, where America's positioned in the world, you know, what the next 4 years are going to look like. All these things are very vitally important, just as it was vitally important what the conditions were that a Jew would live under in the first century. All those things were vitally important. It's just that in the greater context, when we look at what's happening in our physical world, and then we become blind to the spiritual world, it's the spiritual world that's going to last. We're living in a moment right now, and we're living in a moment of rust and dust. And it's important because it's all we know. It's how we connect to each other through our senses. And through our relationships, we find the meaning of life. So we understand how important it is. And yet, Jesus walked for 3.5 years. Hat tip to Kanye. When Jesus walked, he was trying to say, look beyond the horizon. Look beyond the horizon. And it was hard for people to do because we're creatures of our appetites. Our stomach growls and we lose all our sensibilities, just like the Israelites in the wilderness, right? We needed a Snickers bar when Jesus was talking about a bread beyond physical bread that man needs to live by. And so he's put to death. And he comes back, and these men are in despair, and he begins to walk with them, and he says to them, listen, I don't recommend this. I mean, there's people that try and live as Jesus would live. And I think Jesus wants to live inspired by his life, but there's things that Jesus could do. He had a greater capacity. And there's things Jesus could do that we can't do. We can't look into somebody's heart and make judgments. And I don't recommend you speaking to people who are in mourning from the death of a friend this way. But Jesus says, you morons, you slow of thought and heart, why wouldn't you believe everything that's written by the prophets about this deliverer? Now, this got their attention because no one speaks to people that way when they're coming from a funeral, right? So they start out by thinking this guy's a dope, right? He doesn't know the breaking news of the day. And now, I don't know, they're probably put back because he's insulted them. Now, listen, I want you to think about something. We're going to have communion in just a few minutes, but I want you to think about something. These guys weren't present in the upper room. They weren't there. They weren't at the crucifixion. Everything they know about it, they heard, probably from the apostles, right? In the 3 days in between the death of Jesus and the events of the night of his rest and them walking home, they had to hear what happened, and they weren't there. And you know what happens when somebody you love and you find out they die, and you find out they die, and all these things rush through your head, and you wish you were there. You wish you had that one last moment just to say, I love you, and I appreciate you, and I wish I said it more while you were here. Well, they went through all that. They're going through all that when they bump into Jesus. And they had to hear secondhand what happened. They had to hear that on the night of Passover, Jesus took the slave position, and he got up from the table and he washed the feet of the disciples. And he taught this lesson about he who is least in the kingdom is the greatest. And he even washed the feet of Judas, our brother who betrayed him. You won't believe it, Judas betrayed him, Cleopas. And you hear this story and you're distraught. And he's dead in a tomb and you're walking home, rethinking everything because, your election chances are blown now. And who knows what the economy is going to look like. And you're walking back into darkness. I mean, Frodo didn't get the ring into the fires of Mordor now. I mean, Frodo's dead. So, what is your hope? You're walking home and you meet this stranger who's walking the same way. You share a path with him, and he says, "Are you so slow that you don't believe everything the prophets wrote?" And he takes him back into the prophets where they wrote about the suffering of this deliverer and then his future glory. And he relates this story to them, and they're listening intently, and they finally get home, and it's dark. And Jesus continues to walk away, and they say, wait a minute, it's dark, why don't you come in and have dinner with us? And he comes in, and they're about to have dinner. Now, we started this whole message here in John and Yoko's apartment in New York City. It was all white. Everything was white, very minimalist. And Carole King sitting there with her boyfriend, Rick. And they have very different mindsets, right? And John Lennon, whatever you think of him, is expressing really a Christ-like attitude toward his neighbor when he says, what about everybody else? And this sticks in the mind of Carole King, so much so that many years after the fact, when she's writing her autobiography, she shares that story. It stuck with her. And what happens? 5 years later, John is gone down. Her boyfriend, Rick, I don't want to speak ill of the dead, but he was an abuser. It was the hardest chapter in her life because he beat her. The man preparing for the apocalypse, preparing for Armageddon. He had his issues. He had his demons. Physical abuse was one of them. He would end up overdosing on heroin. Two very different avenues, and yet we remember one of them. At least Carole King does. What does this mean for Cleopas? What does it mean for you today? I'll say this to you. Have you ever had a heartbreak? The love of your life has broken up with you, right? And maybe you're walking through the streets during the Christmas time or around Valentine's Day. It doesn't matter. I mean, you see lovers everywhere, but you see people holding hands and you see people kissing or snuggling together in a movie theater. And you're not at a place where you're okay with that. It bothers you. It reveals your own emptiness. Maybe your own wounds come to the surface and remind you that you're broken. And it's hard for you to appreciate that other people are experiencing something that is now foreign to you or now maybe in tatters. Do you know there's people like that right now who feel this way about Easter or Christmas? And all the joy that you're sharing online in your He is Risen posts hurts them because they're not part of the choir. Now, I'm not saying don't share your joy. I think you should, and you'll see in a minute why. But I'm saying I think we need to be empathetic towards those whom either think this is strange, right, and they just want to eat the chocolate eggs, or they're hurt by it somehow. People who've been wounded by Christians or by the faith, and maybe they question the whole idea of Jesus because of some of the doubts, the emotional doubts that have been put in front of them, the obstacles. And they don't share your joy in the He is Risen and the empty tomb and, all the stuff that you're sharing online. And, they don't want to be at the party where you've got the funny hat on and you're blowing that thing, the noisemaker, and twirling that. That's not for them, and they want to find somewhere to hide during this period. And if you're that person and you're watching that show right now, I'm speaking to you. I want to speak to you because I want to say that, Christians call this the greatest story ever told, right? The redemption story of Jesus Christ. And it doesn't come across like that to everyone because we've gotten caught up in information and in arguing with people about the evidence, and the beauty of the story has been sucked out of it. And that's why we respond better to things like, well, what you're seeing over my daughter's shoulder is Aslan with Lucy and her sister Susan. This is the resurrected Aslan, and they climb on his back to run to the witch's castle and breathe life into the dead, which is the redemption story. Now, how come we love it when we see it in Narnia, but it makes some of us cringe when we hear it from fellow Christians? And that's because the beauty of the story is missing. I mentioned Tolkien earlier. Tolkien talked about the crucifixion and the resurrection as the greatest Eucatastrophe in all of fairy tales. Called it the true myth, the one that came true. But he uses the term Eucatastrophe. In other words, he's saying there was a tragedy to it. And there was. Our side of it is a tragedy, that we didn't realize who Jesus was, that we nailed him to the cross and raised him up, that we spit, we mocked, we turned an indifferent eye, maybe we fled in fear. Maybe we just saw him as a prophet. In the best of our thinking, we didn't really realize who he was. We thought he was sent from God, but he couldn't be who he really was saying. So we missed it. We missed the full story, the full glory. But Tolkien calls it a eucatastrophe. It's a catastrophe that has a tragedy to it, and you're on the edge of an abyss, and you think it's hopeless, and all of a sudden, in the east comes Gandalf riding over the horizon, right? And there's a resolution that ends in joy. So this is the story, folks. And if you missed that story, on behalf of the church, I apologize to you, because there is a beauty to it. Tolkien says it's the story that every man deep in his heart wants to be true. And I think as Christians, we need to get back to the beauty, the majesty, and the mystery of that story, and in declaring that story, and not getting distracted by lesser things. Not to say evidence isn't important, it is. But the story is beautiful. Now, to the skeptic, I want to say, to the honest skeptic, I just want to say this. You have to find it remarkable, even if you believe this is a farce, that it's not true, that it's merely a fairy tale. You have to find it remarkable that after 2,000 years, it's still around. I mean, we've left a lot of great stories behind, and only historians know them, or they've been forgotten in history. And yet the Christ story, I mean, no one knows Mithras, but we all know Jesus Christ. There's something about it. So it's either the greatest story ever told, or it's the greatest story ever sold, and it's the greatest propaganda event in world history. And even if it's that, let's start there. Let's start as it's BS. Let's pretend we're Penn and Teller and we think the whole thing's BS. That's remarkable BS. I mean, this was an illiterate by the standards of the day, never formal training. This was a day workman, a carpenter, or a mason. Never wrote a book. So, by natural standards, he was just a criminal who was put to death in a very cruel way, in a demeaning, humiliating way. And now people wear crosses around their necks. Bikini models wear a cross around their neck. And it's a trinket, and it's jewelry, and it might not mean as much to them as the priest that you've just heard his homily, but that's amazing. That's amazing. There was a Jewish rabbi named Gamaliel, and he didn't believe Jesus, at least as far as we know. But when Jesus' followers were brought in front of the Sanhedrin to be put to death for preaching Jesus rose from the dead. He said, wait, guys. He said, look, I'll tell you what. In our lifetimes, this has happened twice before. There were two other men that Israel thought would be Messiah figures. They got a following of like 400, 800 guys. We put them to death, right? And what happened? It frittered out. Within a few weeks, these followers were following somebody else, or they were just not believing in anything because their faith was crushed. They were like Cleopas on the Emmaus Road. So Gamaliel's advice to these people was, don't put these guys to death. Don't kill John and Peter because their Messiah's dead. He's already dead. And if it's not of God, it'll be tumbleweed. It won't take root and grow and produce fruit. They'll be forgotten in a generation. Gamaliel said this in the 60s, 60 AD. And 2,000 years later, not only do we know the name of Jesus Christ, we know the name of Gamaliel because of Jesus Christ. His prophecy kind of came true. So look, if all you believe is that this is the greatest story ever sold, I ask you to contemplate that for a while. And ask yourself, what's the probability of us remembering, or even remembering the name of Jesus' mother? Now back to Cleopas. Cleopas and his co-disciple, they don't recognize Jesus, but Jesus comes in. And he comes in, and they sit down to supper. And this is where I want to share with you the bread and the wine. Do you have yours, Pay?
Yeah.
All right. I'm going to switch to you so they can see you too. Let's try that. That's a good angle. So anyway, if you're at home and you have the bread and the wine, I want to take you not back to the upper room where what you think was the Lord's Supper was inaugurated, but I want to take you into the presence of Cleopas and his fellow disciple who are sitting across this table from a stranger. And their hearts are on such fire because he's just given them hope by explaining to them the Eucatastrophe of the suffering servant, risen again to come into his glory. And they've just heard this, and they've heard it from Moses, and they've heard it from David, and they've heard it from Jeremiah, and they've heard it from Isaiah, and they've heard it from all the stories that they grew up on, sitting on their mother's lap, hearing it repeated to them in CCD, right, or in Hebrew school. They heard these stories over and over, but they never meant anything to them. They meant something else, as they meant something else to Saul, Benjamin, Tarsus, Paulus, until he came into collision with the real Christ. And they're about to collide with the real Christ. And they've heard all the stories where Jesus connects the dots between the prophets of old and the Nazarene. And they want to believe. And all of a sudden, Jesus picks up the bread. Now, I guarantee you, it wasn't a King Hawaiian roll, which is what I've got today, because they were out of matzah at the Fry's in my neighborhood. They were out of matzah, so we're doing it with this. Now, if you want to do it with a cracker, fine. These are symbols. These are to make us, or to help us remember, like a flannel graph, like that. Now, I don't want to try and minimize this in your heart. If you're a Catholic, just ignore this part. Or if you're a Lutheran who thinks that this is more than symbolism, that's all right, ignore it. Jesus says, as oft as you do this, do it in remembrance of me. Now, Cleopas and his friend were sitting there just like Peyton and I. And we're looking at a stranger, and all of a sudden he picks up the bread to break it. He offers a blessing on it. He prays over it as Jesus did at the Last Supper in the upper room where they weren't there. And he breaks the bread, and they recognize who it is. And I'm sure they can hear in the back of their head, this is my body, which is broken for you. And the text tells us that it's at this point. Let me find it for you. It's at this point, and here is what happened. He sat down at the table with them, taking the bread, he blessed and broke and gave it to them. And at that moment, open-eyed, wide-eyed, they recognized him. And then he disappeared. And in their mind, they're thinking, and this is the blood of the new covenant, which is shed for thee. This is why we remember. This is just one of the ways in how we remember. So I want to close today by sharing something for you about true love and how love does make us vulnerable. You know, you all know I'm fond of Brene Brown. And Brene had, I am going to show you a picture. Oh, you're right. Should we do that now?
Yeah.
Okay, Peyton wants us to show you her picture and her project. So let's cut to that. And Peyton's project for this week, folks, is a garden tomb. And she made this with her mommy earlier in the week, right? Do you want to talk about it?
Well, this is wheatgrass, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then these are special stones. They're like crystals. I think this small one was from a necklace that broke. I'm not sure. And this one I don't know, but it's really pretty and green. And then these are just a stone path. And then this is a big stone.
Thank you. Do you have a picture you want to show us too?
Sure. This is Advent taking a nap on some grass. And then this is a big Easter basket with color Easter eggs. And then this is my project to set as a picture. And then this is wine and this is bread.
And is that Jesus with Cleopas?
I don't know.
You don't know, but that's somebody about to break the bread in our story. All right. Thanks, Pay. Love and vulnerability. Brene Brown has studied vulnerability, and really when I read her, I can't help but think of C.S. Lewis, but I want to share a quote for you from Brene because I think this is our bread. This is something we need to really pray about. Vulnerability is the birthplace of love, belonging, joy, courage, empathy, and creativity. It is the source of hope, empathy, accountability, and authenticity. If we want greater clarity in our purpose or deeper and more meaningful spiritual lives, vulnerability is the path. So, we spend so much of our lives trying to live invulnerable. And it's one of the reasons that we love Marvel movies. We love to project upon ourselves or relate to the Men of Steel that can live almost an invulnerable existence. And yet, even in our myths, our heroes are vulnerable, whether it be kryptonite or a chink in our character. There is something that's very human about even our heroes. And it's the vulnerability in us that make possible the Eucatastrophe in our lives, to bring the joy out of the sorrow. And it's when we try and protect ourselves from vulnerability that we turn into something else. I'm going to cut back to Brene, and she said to love is to be vulnerable, to give someone your heart and to say, I know this could hurt so bad, but I'm willing to be vulnerable and love you. I know she doesn't credit Lewis here, but many years before she wrote that, C.S. Lewis wrote in The Four Loves, to love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything, and your heart will be wrung and possibly broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give it to no one, not even an animal. Wrap it carefully round with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in the casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. To love at all is to be vulnerable. Folks, if we are going to love our neighbor, it's going to make us vulnerable. We can't love without vulnerability because Christ calls us to love in a sacrificial fashion, to put another's well-being in front of our own, to kneel and to wash feet, to pray for those who persecute us, to stand in their stead, and then to forgive them when they betray us. Our sister, Rachel Held Evans, I think, said it in a very, very beautiful way. And I'm going to have to go there. Let's see. Not there. Here. She's with the Lord now. She's celebrating Resurrection Day in the presence of He who said, I am the resurrection and the life. But she once wrote, we could not become like God. Men have tried. We've all tried, but we can't. We cannot become like God. So God became like us, the incarnation. God showed us how to heal instead of kill. His life, His ministry, His words, His characters, His deed. He showed us how to mend instead of destroy, how to love instead of hate, how to live instead of long for more. And when we nailed God to a tree, God forgave. And when we buried God in the ground, God got up. That's our story. That's His story. That's Easter. That's what we celebrate. But folks, people aren't going to see it in a movie. Or in a book, or in a sermon, and remember it. Not like they do when they see it across from them. When the bread is broken in our words and our deeds, in our forgiveness, in our care, in our compassion, in our listening. The very simplest thing we could do is first to listen to their story and not to interrupt them. I hope you have a wonderful Easter. We've got some exciting news coming up. We're going to start a series of interviews with people for the Sparrows Call. It starts this week with Keith Giles. Keith is an author, and, he's written the Jesus series, Jesus Undefeated, Jesus Unveiled, Jesus Untangled, Jesus Unbound. He's one of the co-talent, the Heretic Happy Hour. And we're going to interview Keith on Tuesday, and we hope you join us next week as well. I pray that your Easter is wonderful. I have to admit to you, I relish these moments of being home with my family and knowing that I don't have to wonder where my sons are at right now. I mean, I hope this is over shortly and our country comes through this stronger, and I hope your family can endure this, even in a time of scarcity and financial privation and social privation. I hope this makes us stronger as a people, at least as lovers. I ask you to pray for God to open your heart to those who aren't inspired by joy when they see the expression, He is risen. Give us the talent. Give us the motivation and the inspiration to speak as Lewis spoke or as Tolkien spoke, and just to be able to tell a story again, even if it's a story they don't fully believe. Help us to connect them with the magic of the redemption story. And truth will win out. Truth will play out. God has given us imagination and curiosity to bring us to the foot of the cross. That's the whole purpose of it. Don't put obstacles in the way of it. Don't let our own ego or our own tribe or our own team get in the way from giving the object of God's love an unobstructed view of nail-pierced hands breaking a piece of bread and inviting them to the table. God bless you all, and thank you for joining us today. We'll see you next week.